please. "2007 will mark the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. By pausing to remember veterans and reflect upon their sacrifices, we honor and thank all those who served and those who died protecting our country. It is indeed a privilege for the members of the legislature to welcome some of Nova Scotia's veterans here today. We are also very pleased to have with us today officials and members of the Armed Forces, retired service personnel, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, students from the Sacred Heart School of Halifax who participate in Veterans Week activities, along with their principal and teachers. In addition, we have a number of representatives from cadets and other organizations. Indeed, welcome to one and all here to this historic chamber. I would now ask our honored veterans to please rise if they are able. Members of the legislature, please rise and join me in welcoming our honored veterans to the House. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, veterans, our distinguished guests, former Lieutenant Governor, the Honourable J. James Kinley and Mrs. Kinley. Mr. Speaker, following this resolution that I am about to make and comments by my colleagues, I will be asking the House to rise for a moment of silence in commemoration of the sacrifice of Canadians at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 90 years ago, Easter Monday, it was the bravery and sheer tenacity of the 100,000 soldiers of the 4 Canadian Army divisions, including the remarkable Nova Scotian troops in both the 25th and 85th Battalions, that would overtake the previously invincible German-occupied 14-kilometre-long Vimy Ridge in northern France. And whereas it was a defining moment of our young nation and for the Allies in the First World War, but it also meant a great deal in human costs, with some 3,600 sacrificing their lives and thousands more wounded. Whereas the newly restored Canadian National Vimy Memorial remains standing in grand reverence to the valor of the fallen and of all who broke this German stronghold in the name of peace and freedom. Therefore, be it resolved that on this important yet solemn anniversary, all members of this House salute the soldiers who selflessly and stubbornly moved the alliance forces forward in the defense of the freedom of our neighbors, and by doing what many thought impossible, transform this country into a great nation. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition. The Honourable Minister responsible for military relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon to the members and as well, especially to our guests at the gallery today. Mr. Speaker, the Allied victory at Vimy Ridge 90 years ago this month represents not only a great Allied victory in the First World War, but it was in every respect a Canadian victory. Prior to this battle, Canadian soldiers fought as part of the British Army, and it wasn't until just after the advance on Vimy Ridge that the 100,000-strong Canadian Corps was formed. This battle, Mr. Speaker, was fought by Canada's citizen soldiers, the sons of farmers, fishermen, foresters, employees from every walk of life in our nation. They were led by other Canadians from the same professions. Their innovative methods and tactics and their unorthodox approach to this battle were the very key to their victory. There were several very significant battles of the Western Front in which Canadians participated, Mr. Speaker. These battles were major milestones on the road to Vimy Ridge. Battles whose names now appear on many of Canada's famed regiments as battle honours. They include Ypres, Forest Aubert, Jabonagi in 1915, and Somme in 1916. Vimy Ridge was key to the German defence system. 61 metres above the Douai Plain, it protected an area of occupied France, where mines and factories were in full production for Germany's war effort. It covered the junction of the main Hindenburg Line and the defence systems running north to the coast of the English Channel. Since capturing the ridge in October 1914, the Germans added fortifications and obstacles, and the slopes of Vimy Ridge favored the defenders. Until the Canadians agreed to dislodge the German defenders, Vimy Ridge cost 150,000 French and British soldiers. The commander of the Canadian Corps, Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng, assisted by Major General Arthur Currie, planned the assault. The Canadian Corps, with all four of its divisions together for the first time, would simultaneously deliver an attack against Vimy Ridge. The infantry assault was preceded by a massive artillery barrage which began on March 20th. This involved more than 1,000 heavy guns, howitzers, and field artillery. On April 2nd, the bombardment was stepped up. By the time the infantry was set out, a million artillery shells had battered the Germans. One Canadian commented that shells poured over his head on enemy positions like water from a hose. More than 80% of the German guns had been identified. Few survived intact. Germans called the period the Week of Suffering. Trenches were shattered, and a new artillery shell fuse demolished many barbed wire entanglements, easing the Canadians' dangerous path into combat. At 5:30 a.m., April 9, 1917, Easter Monday, the creeping artillery barrage began to move steadily towards the Germans. Behind it advanced 20,000 soldiers of the first attacking wave of the 4 Canadian divisions leading the assault. The greatest resistance came from the machine guns in the German line. However, 3 of the 4 divisions captured their part of Vimy Ridge by midday, right on schedule. In the final stage, the 2nd Canadian Division was assisted by the British 13th Brigade, which fell under its command for the operation. Mr. Speaker, Canadians should be proud of the achievements of our soldiers of that day. Vimy Ridge marked the only significant success of the Allied Spring Offensive of 1917. The Canadian Corps had captured more ground, more prisoners, and more guns than any previous British offense in 2.5 years of war. It was one of the most complete and decisive engagements of the Great War and the greatest Allied victory up to that time. The Canadians had demonstrated they were one of the outstanding formations on the Western Front and masters of offensive warfare. Although the victory at Vimy came swiftly, Mr. Speaker, it came with a heavy cost. There were 3,598 dead out of 10,602 Canadian casualties. Battalions in the first waves of the assault bore the heaviest casualties. Thanks to good planning and thorough preparations, however, the losses and wounded at Vimy were far lower than the battles of many other major assaults on the Western Front. They were also far lighter than those of any previous offense on the Ridge. Earlier French, British, and German struggles there had cost at least 200,000 casualties. The Canadian success at Vimy marked a profound turning point for the Allies. Mr. Speaker, a year and a half later, the Great War was over. The Canadian record, beginning with our victory at Vimy, won for Canada a separate signature on the Versailles Peace Treaty, ending the war. Back home, the victory at Vimy, won by troops from every part of the country, including, Mr. Speaker, the 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders, who were sent in as reinforcements, helped to unite Canadians in pride at the courage of their citizen soldiers. This was, in a very real sense, the birth of Canada as a nation. Mr. Speaker, we as Canadians will be forever grateful. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me to have a few minutes to speak today. It's important at the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge to pay tribute to the young Canadians and Nova Scotians who made the ultimate sacrifice at Vimy. One look at the photographs of those who took Vimy Ridge 90 years ago shows just how young they really were. But despite their youth, what they accomplished that day has come to be defined as an event that set Canada apart as a nation unto itself, apart from its colonial past. As one American put it at the time, Vimy brought forth in Canada's history one of the great days, a day of glory to furnish inspirations to their sons for generations. At dawn, Easter Monday, April 19th, 1917, the Battle of Vimy Ridge began. And after less than 2 hours, 3 of the 4 Canadian divisions had taken their objectives. The 4th Division was held up on the highest point of the ridge, which was known as Hill 145. The 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders were intended to fill a supply and construction role, but they were sent in instead as reinforcements. By the end of the day, Hill 145 was in Canadian control. A French soldier, upon hearing of the victory, said, "It is impossible." And then when he was informed that it was the Canadians that took the hill, he said, "Ah, the Canadians, it is possible." The Battle of Vimy Ridge solidified the reputation of the Canadians as among the finest troops in the world. Troops that take on the most difficult tasks and succeed where others have failed. It's a reputation that remains strong 90 years later. Today, world conflicts continue to call for Canada's best. In Afghanistan, Canadian men and women continue to uphold the legacy that was born in 1917 on Vimy Ridge. Today is a day to remember Canadians and Nova Scotians at Vimy, and I am pleased and proud to be able to take part in this day in this way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On April 9, 1917, Easter Monday marked the first time all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps worked together as one formation. They didn't know at the time that they would be responsible for the victory of one of the greatest battles during the First World War, the battle that would become our country's finest hour. After training for months with models of the trench systems and drills on the mission ahead, they were prepared and ready for the battle. Using innovative optical and acoustical techniques, Canadian troops perfected new ways to locate enemy artillery guns. The Battle of Vimy Ridge began at 5:30 a.m. that Easter morning with some of the heaviest fire seen during the war. Canadians braved the snow, sleet, wind, and machine gun fire for 5 days before they would finally defeat the Germans. First, the Corps captured Hill 145, where today the Canadian National Vimy Memorial sits, and days later they conquered the remainder of the ridge. The victory came at a high cost to the Canadian Corps with approximately 11,000 casualties, including 3,600 fatalities. 4 Canadians would win the Victoria Cross, our nation's highest medal for military valor. Private William Milne, Lance Sergeant Ellis Sifton, Captain Thane McDowell, and Private John Pattison. Many say that it was on this hill that Canada came of age. Others say it's the day that Canada truly became a country. Regiments from coast to coast fought together in a distinctly Canadian triumph, creating a stronger sense of identity. For Canada had accomplished what the French and the British had failed to do, which was capture Vimy Ridge. After this victory, the Germans took extra care when the Canadians were involved in a battle. Quote, "Whenever the Germans found that Canadians coming into the line, they prepared for the worst," end quote, wrote wartime British Prime Minister David Lloyd George in his memoirs. In hearing of the victory at Vimy Ridge, a French soldier is said to have exclaimed, "C'était possible." And in hearing that it was Canadians who had won the battle, he replied, "Ah, les Canadiens, c'est possible." Canada's military achievements during this battle raised our international reputation and helped earn the nation a separate signature on the Treaty of Versailles. The victory at Vimy Ridge was one of the most complete offensive victories in the war. The victory gained Canada a reputation as skilled offensive operators on the Western Front. By the end of the battle, Canadians had captured more ground, more prisoners, more ammunition, and more equipment than any previous British offensive during the war. Nova Scotia soldiers played a pivotal role in the battle for Vimy. The experienced 25th Nova Scotia Battalion was among the troops, but it was the untested 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders who were called upon from their reserve positions in order to attack. They braved the gunfire and refused to retreat despite the lack of cover. Within an hour, the Highlanders, who had fought like veteran soldiers, captured Hill 145, the center of the German defense. The Highlanders paid a high price for their victory, suffering many casualties and losing about 25% of their unit. 90 years later, the Battle of Vimy Ridge remains Canada's greatest military victory. Today, on land granted to Canada for all time by a grateful France, the Canadian National Vimy Memorial sits atop Hill 145. It is inscribed with the names of 11,285 Canadian soldiers who were listed as missing, presumed dead in France. It is a tribute to all who served our country in battle and risked or gave their lives in the war. They gave the ultimate price for the freedom we now enjoy. Today, and over the Easter weekend, is the time to remember the sacrifices and achievements of Canada's veterans. Their legacy must be preserved for future generations. We cannot allow the sacrifices or the values and principles they fought for to be forgotten. À tous nos anciens combattants, on vous remercie du fond de notre cœur pour votre défense de notre pays et de nos libertés. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
I'd now like to ask all those who are able to please rise for a moment of silence. Thank you. Please be seated. At this time, before proceeding to the regular business of the House, we just want to take this opportunity to thank our honored and esteemed guests for joining with us. And for those that have joined with us, you'll notice as well that today is Tartan Day, celebrated here at Province House in Nova Scotia. And as many would know, a tartan is about symbolizing who we are, and it tells a story about what we are. And thankfully, it's twinned with this ceremony today in commemoration, because our celebration of Tartan Day is a celebration as a free and democratic people, and we thank our veterans for preserving that, and we honor them here today. So thank you to all who have come. We will now enter the regular business of the House, and so any guests that have to retire, please feel free to do so, and we'll now continue with the business of the legislature. Thank you once again to all our guests. We now shall commence with the daily routine. Presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I present this petition, would it be possible to make an introduction?
Please do.
Thank you very much. In the gallery opposite is Fred Whalen, the Warden of Kings County, and his wife Anne. And I'd like to welcome them and ask the House to recognize them appropriately. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to present a petition. The operative clause is we want the government to recognize the importance of supporting Nova Scotia pork farmers and take action to avoid the loss of more agricultural production in Nova Scotia. For our part, we'll ask our grocers to feature more local pork in their stores, and we will look for Nova Scotia pork products when we shop. We ask the province create the policies needed to ensure that we can buy local pork, support local farmers and their families, and ensure the future of key processing facilities like Larson's plant in Berwick. It's submitted by the Kings County with a total of 4,387 names, and I've affixed my signature to it.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister responsible for military relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas several hundred Nova Scotia service personnel of the regular and reserve components of the Canadian Forces who have family members throughout the province have deployed to Afghanistan, and whereas the Department of National Defence provided video conference facilities to Halifax and Region Military Family Resource Centre that were incapable with existing communications equipment at the facilities, and whereas Eastlink Communications of Halifax volunteered to connect the equipment and then further volunteered to provide the Military Family Resource Centre with a real-time, high-quality video conference link for up to 3 years at no charge, so Nova Scotians can speak with their family members deployed in Afghanistan. Therefore, be resolved, all members of this House acknowledge the generosity and the community spirit of Eastlink Communications for their support to the families of servicemen and servicewomen who are serving with the Canadian Forces in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I could just make a comment before I start. I just want to thank you for facilitating and permitting us to bring into the House a memento from the Tourism, Culture and Heritage Department, the Nova Scotia Tartan Scarf, in our effort to help the House celebrate Tartan Day. And also, I guess, Mr. Speaker, today it really takes on dual meaning with the members of our armed forces, the veterans that were here in the past, to remember the people in the Nova Scotians lost at Vimy Ridge. So, Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for more than 20 years, Canadians and Scottish descent have donned their kilts and other tartan attire on April the 6th to celebrate their heritage on Tartan Day. And whereas the tartan and traditions that Scottish settlers brought here to Nova Scotia continue to shape our culture and enrich our lives to this day. Whereas Tartan Day originated 21 years ago in Nova Scotia thanks to the efforts of Jean Watson, who has been named 2007 Scot of the Year by the Scottish Studies Society. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House celebrate Tartan Day and congratulate Jean Watson on the well-deserved recognition she is receiving for her efforts to promote Scottish culture in Nova Scotia and across the country. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. And I, too, would like to thank the previous speaker and his legislative assistant for affording the tradition of establishing Nova Scotia tabs for the legislature. So thank you, the Honourable Minister of Justice. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. whereas the recent Canada Winter Games in Whitehorse presented an environmental challenge in that 25 bags of compostable material and 14 bags of plastic recyclables were collected on the first Monday of the Games, and whereas athletes and officials from all provinces were encouraged by the Games Green Team to properly sort the recyclables in bins provided to ensure the Winter Games event was the most environmental yet, and whereas Ms. Joanna Smith, a leader of the Winter Games Green Team, found that Team Nova Scotia was the most green of all the provinces attending the Winter Games. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in commending Team Nova Scotia for their gold medal performance in advancing Nova Scotia's reputation as a recycling leader. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's tourism industry employs more than 33,000 people, many of them in small businesses, and whereas Camilla Peck of Catalone, Cape Breton, was one of those industry professionals running a bed and breakfast operation in her home for more than 50 years. And whereas Ms. Peck wrote to the department in March advising that she was retiring after a career that contributed to our tourism industry and enriched her life with fabulous friends, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Ms. Peck on her 50 years of impeccable service in the tourism industry and wish her all the best during her well-earned retirement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Parker Street Food Bank has been a valued and well-utilized member of the Halifax community since its establishment in 1983 and addition of a furniture bank in 1995, and whereas the organization has helped countless people deal with adversity, even while facing its own adversity, like a devastating fire in 2001. And whereas the Parker Street Food and Furniture Bank has started a new initiative called Great Things in Store, a retail outlet of donated goods that will help subsidize its efforts to provide necessities and services. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Parker Street Food and Furniture Bank for its continued support of those who are in need in our province and wish them much success with their new endeavour as they strive to improve the quality of life for those who come through their doors. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I'd like to do an introduction. If
Please
possible.
do.
Thank you. I'd like to bring to the attention of the members of the House two very distinct individuals who are in the Speaker's Gallery today, and I'd ask them to rise. I'd like to introduce Assistant Commissioner Ian Atkins of H Division RCMP and Ruth McClay, who's Inspector of Corporate Planning and Client Services for H Division. They're here today as a result of some ongoing celebrations. As members would know, it's the 75th anniversary of policing services through the RCMP to Nova Scotia as a provincial police force. And thank you to the generosity of the Speaker. We have a display downstairs and asked all members to take advantage of the opportunity to see the fine artifacts and memorabilia of the RCMP from the many years of service to this province. So welcome today, and I ask the House to give them a warm welcome. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on April 1, 1932, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police assumed the role of Nova Scotia's provincial police force, and whereas after 75 years of dedicated service, the Nova Scotia RCMP Division continues to provide excellence in service by ensuring the safety and security of our citizens. And whereas this government and all Nova Scotians are tremendously grateful for the hard work and dedication shown by the RCMP in our province, therefore be resolved that all members of this House recognize the important role the RCMP plays in communities throughout Nova Scotia, and that all members congratulate the Nova Scotia RCMP on the occasion of its 75th anniversary as our provincial police force. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give a notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Chuck Chartmill of C-Vision, Global Manufacturing Innovators of Amherst, Nova Scotia, has been named Atlantic Entrepreneur of the Year by Ernst & Young. And whereas Mr. Cartmill's personal vision has resulted in the development and implementation of manufacturing processes that eliminate the use of 6 environmentally hazardous substances. And whereas his business venture has and does pursue environmental innovation that exceeds consumer expectations while achieving international scale business success. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in commending Chuck Chartmill for exhibiting environmentally responsible business practices. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister responsible for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the end of this resolution, Mr. Speaker, if the House accepts it, I'll be asking that on behalf of the Metro Coalition for Non-Racist Society that the Speaker forward a copy of this resolution along with 4 Nova Scotian flags that members of Nova Scotia Society have signed on behalf of the members of this legislature. So I'll ask that request beforehand, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Government of Nova Scotia supports equality in the Aboriginal people of Nova Scotia in the province, and whereas the Government of Nova Scotia has a strong record of working with the federal government and Aboriginal leaders to ensure that appropriate supports are realized for the future of well-being of Aboriginal people and communities in Nova Scotia, and whereas the Government of Nova Scotia supports Bill C-292, an act to implement the Kelowna Accord. Therefore, be resolved all members of this House support the efforts of the Metro Coalition for a Non-Racist Society to encourage the federal government to implement the results of the First Minister's meeting on Aboriginal issues, or the Kelowna Accord, held in Kelowna, British Columbia, in November 2005. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Require that Government Buildings Constructed in the Future Comply with Green Energy and Environmental Design Standards.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Require that Government Buildings Constructed in the Future Comply with Green Energy and Environmental Design Standards.
178, entitled An Act to Require that Government Buildings Constructed in the Future Comply with Green Energy and Environmental Design Standards.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 340 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Pension Benefits Act.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 340 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Pension Benefits Act.
Bill 179, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 340 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Pension Benefits Act.
Ordered that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 4th marks Tartan Day, and this month celebrates the 50th anniversary of Cape Breton tartan. And whereas the Cape Breton tartan was inspired by the 1907 poem, The Lady of the Loom, by Lillian Crew Walsh. And whereas Lillian Crew Walsh gave her poem to her friend Elizabeth Bell Grant, and they collaborated to design the Cape Breton tartan in 1957. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly celebrate Tartan Day in this month, which marks the 50th anniversary of the world-famous Cape Breton tartan. I seek waiver of notice, Mr. Speaker.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the upcoming Easter weekend 2007 will mark the 90th anniversary of the First World War Canadian military attack on Vimy Ridge, France. Whereas while other Allied forces failed to take the 14-kilometre escarpment, the 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders played a crucial role in securing Vimy Ridge. Whereas the Vimy Memorial Monument now rests in the place of that battle and lists the approximately 11,285 soldiers who lost their lives in France and whose remains were never found, protecting the freedoms we now enjoy today. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly honour the brave Canadian soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice at Vimy Ridge and all other Canadian soldiers who put their lives on the line so Canadians can enjoy the freedoms we do have today. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas le Club de Kinsmen, the Club Kinsmen, de Châteauquin, celebrated its 30-year anniversary in January. And whereas this local service club and its membership are a valued part of our local community. And whereas over the past 3 decades, the hardworking members of le Club Kinsmen de Châteauquin have raised and invested back into their community over $3 million. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Châteauquin membership of this International Service Club on their many years of dedicated community service. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a class here from my constituency, and you'll notice in the East Gallery some very fresh faces from Inverness County, specifically from the Port Hawkesbury area. In that area, Tamarack Education Centre. We have 45 grade 5s, accompanied by 4 adults. 23 are from the French immersion class, and if they just heard my French, Mr. Speaker, you'll know that I did not go through with the French immersion class. 22 English speaking students. We also, as I mentioned, they're accompanied by Sharon Ryan, Giselle Boudreau, Marilee Kale, and Gavin Namey. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the students from my area to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Indeed, we welcome our special guests and all guests to the visitors to the gallery today. The Honourable the Premier.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I simply wanted to point out the little girl in the front with the pink on, if she'll stand up, that would be a cousin of mine, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, okay.
A special welcome to my cousin.
It's Tartan Day. We're all big one happy family in Nova Scotia today. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Annapolis Royal occupies a special and unique role in history as the first capital of our province of Nova Scotia from 1710 until the founding of Halifax in 1749. And whereas the beautiful, dynamic town of Annapolis Royal has a long and rich historical connection with the equally historical city of Annapolis, Maryland, in the United States. And whereas the town of Annapolis Royal and the city of Annapolis, Maryland, are now engaged in the process of twinning and will exchange visits in preparation for next year as Annapolis, Maryland reaches a significant milestone in its existence. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly extend congratulations to Annapolis, Maryland, as it celebrates 300 years of its incorporation in 2008. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Deacon Gordon Dale Wright has received the Reverend William Pearlie Oliver Wall of Honor Award on March 3, 2007, presented by the Black Cultural Society of Nova Scotia. Whereas Deacon Wright has been a member of the Victoria Road United Baptist Church for over 50 years, where he served on many boards and committees and was ordained a deacon of his church in 1998. And whereas Deacon Wright has received many awards and recognitions for his dedicated service and involvement in the community and projects throughout his life, therefore be resolved the members of this House of Assembly join me in recognizing Deacon Wright for his most recent well-deserved recognition by the Black Cultural Society of Nova Scotia. And I'd ask for waiver.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas we are fortunate in Nova Scotia to have many excellent eating establishments to choose from, and whereas this year the National Post newspaper asked its readers to submit the name of their favorite restaurants from across Canada, and whereas the Kilted Frenchman Steakhouse, located in Bayport, Nova Scotia, was chosen by National Post readers to receive a People's Choice Restaurant Award. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Kilted Frenchman Steakhouse and its owner, Debbie Scott, on receiving one of the first annual National Post People's Choice Restaurant Awards. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to all the members of the House. I'd like to introduce in the Speaker's Gallery the Chair of our Nova Scotia Arts and Culture Partnership Council, Paul Gallant, Terry Kelly, and also Joella Folds, and all three are members of the Nova Scotia Arts and Culture Partnership Council. Wonderful people to work with. They do a great job on behalf of the people of this province, and I'd just like them to stand and receive a warm welcome from the House.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Lower Sackville resident Jean Watson has been named 2007 Scot of the Year by the Scottish Studies Foundation of Toronto, and whereas Jean Watson, known as the Mother of Tartan, was instrumental in establishing April 6th of every year as Tartan Day, a day to promote Scottish heritage by wearing Scottish attire, and whereas the very first Tartan Day was held in Nova Scotia in 1987, and in the years since then has been adopted by every Canadian Provincial Assembly. Therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate Jean Watson for being named Scot of the Year and acknowledge her dedication to keeping Scottish heritage alive and visible in Nova Scotia and beyond. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Digby-Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas traffic is greatly increasing on our highways to move both people and goods in and out of this city to rural areas and other destinations, and whereas roads are deteriorating faster than we can rebuild them and more traffic is causing greater pollution problems for us all, whereas France is now buying trains from Canada to correct this very same problem by reducing emissions, traffic congestion, and save billions of dollars in roads repair. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly encourage this government to come to life and lobby the federal government for major infrastructure financing to put a fast train from the western end of this province that will continue through Halifax to North Sydney that connects major national and international ferry routes. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? I've heard several no's. The notice is tabled. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas grade 8 student at Whitney Pier Memorial Junior High School, Daniel Bootler, is preparing to compete in the Can West Can Spell National Spelling Bee and whereas the 12-year-old Port Caledonian native will join 40 other students, including another Cape Bretoner, in Ottawa later this month to vie for the title of Canada's Top Speller, and whereas Daniel was runner-up in the regional finals held last month, while the champion declared after an unprecedented 22 rounds exhibiting the quality of Cape Breton's young spellers, therefore be resolved that all members of this House send their congratulations and best wishes to Daniel Bootler when he competes in the Can West Can Spell National Spelling Bee. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers fight heart and stroke disease by raising funds for research, and whereas the Heart and Stroke Foundation provides the platform within which those volunteers operate, and whereas Mary McMullen of Milford Station was recently awarded a golden pin by the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Nova Scotia for 25 years of door-to-door canvassing to raise funds. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Mary McMullen on receiving the Golden Pin Award by the Heart and Stroke Foundation and thank her for her continued fundraising efforts. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on April 9th, 1917, 90 years ago, Canadian troops claimed victory at the historic Battle of Vimy Ridge during the First World War, and whereas this battle measured the significance of the development of Canada as a young nation, and whereas during that fateful battle many brave Canadians paid the ultimate sacrifice, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly remember the Battle of Vimy Ridge of April 9, 1917, and cherish its significance in our history as a nation. I ask for a waiver and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the pork industry in Nova Scotia generates $35 million in farm sales annually, $100 million in spin-offs, and whereas the hog industry employs 1,500 Nova Scotians both directly and in other employment areas, as well as putting $11 million into tax revenue for the province, and whereas this government has not adequately addressed the concerns of pork producers who are in need of a long-term stable plan for the industry, therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly support those who have signed a petition calling on government to take immediate action and save the province's ailing hog industry. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? I hear a no. The notice is tabled. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Autism Centre opened in 2002 to assist parents and many other individuals wanting to support others living with autism spectrum disorder, and whereas the Sheila Nolan Award for Excellence in Teaching in the field of autism is awarded annually to recognize individuals across Nova Scotia for their excellent work in assisting children affected. And whereas Ms. Chris Phillips of the Windsor Forks Elementary School is one of the 5 teaching assistants across Nova Scotia to be presented with the Sheila Nolan Award in 2006, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House applaud teaching excellence and outstanding work done by Windsor Forks Elementary School teaching assistant Chris Phillips on a daily basis in the field of autism. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 50 grade 6 students at Cumberland North Academy in Brookdale have adopted 2 local soldiers, Willis Ripley and Sean McIsaac, currently serving in Afghanistan. And whereas the soldiers will receive thank you cards for being brave and birthday cards on April 7th as they share the same birth month and day, along with other messages of support while on duty. And whereas teacher Nancy Coleman says the students were pleased to think that someone would think they would be doing a good job adopting young men aged 19 and 20, the students from Coleman's class as well as Lowry McLeod's class have sent have seen pictures and received information from the mothers of these soldiers to help make the interaction more personal. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in sending our congratulations to the teachers and students of Cumberland North Academy for their interest and support of these soldiers during their active duty, and wish both a very happy birthday on April the 7th. Mr. Speaker, I respectfully request waiver and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring the attention of members of the House to the East Gallery, West Gallery. I'm a little directionally challenged sometimes, Mr. Speaker, where we're joined today by members of the early childhood learning community. We have Margie Vigneault from the North End Daycare in the beautiful constituency of Halifax Needham, and Valerie Blau, some of the workers from the daycare in the North End Daycare as well. I'd like to recognize them. John McCracken, who's here from CUPE, and I'm sorry, I don't know everybody who's here, but I'd ask you all to rise and take the
Indeed, we welcome all our visitors to Province House today. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas A. Lloyd MacDonald, who passed away on March the 9th, 2007, was a lifelong member of the Liberal Party and capably served the constituents of Pictou East as a member of the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly for 2 terms, and whereas Lloyd MacDonald, as a young man, served his country with distinction in tank warfare during World War II, a member of the 28th Canadian Armoured Regiment in France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. And whereas Lloyd MacDonald returned from overseas to his birthplace of Garden of Eden, Pictou County, raising a family of 5 sons and 2 daughters with his late wife Margaret, and serving his community as a member of the Blair Presbyterian Church Board of Managers, chair of the Garden of Eden Cemetery Committee, member of the Royal Canadian Legion, Branch 75, Eureka, and the Thorburn Veterans Association. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize the contributions of Lloyd MacDonald, a former MLA, and offer condolences to the family members of Alexander Lloyd MacDonald in the event of his passing. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Earl and Ruby States were married on September 21st, 1946 in Newport Station, Nova Scotia, in the home of Reverend Morgan. And whereas Earl and Ruby Bundy have lovingly brought up 9 children and now have 29 grandchildren and 37 great-grandchildren. And whereas Earl joined the military in January 1942 and left on May 4th, 1946, so he could be near his new wife, Ruby. Therefore, be resolved, the members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating Earl Ruby Bundy upon reaching their 60th wedding anniversary on September 21st, 2006. And I'd ask for waiver.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Aberdeen Hospital Foundation and the Aberdeen Hospital Trust celebrated 20 years recently, and whereas former Premier and an original board member, Dr. John Ham, was the guest speaker at the 20th anniversary celebration held recently, and whereas since its inception, the foundation and the trust has accumulated more than $20 million towards maintaining the quality of care at the Aberdeen Hospital. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send their praise for the founders and directors of the Aberdeen Hospital Foundation and Trust on the continued efforts to provide Pictonians with first-class medical treatment. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Justine Mueller, age 20, from Head of St. Margaret's, is presently attending Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, majoring in business management and minoring in economics. And whereas Justine is Vice President of the Political Studies Society and Conference Representative, and she successfully organized an Atlantic Conference for political science students in January of 2007, where 6 universities were represented. And whereas Justine is an impressive young woman involved with the Women in House program, where she was to job shadow a high-profile political woman. But since there were not enough of them, she graciously settled for me instead. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the enthusiasm Justine brings to the political process and wish her the utmost success with her academic pursuits, and perhaps someday a Mount St. Vincent student will job shadow her as a member of this House. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed?
Agreed.
All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas with winter now over and spring on the way, it means championship laurels are being handed out by the Nova Scotia School Athletic Federation in a variety of winter sports. And whereas Dr. J.H. Gillis Rink took home provincial championship honors in the NSAF Girls Championship held at the Liverpool Curling Club from March 24th to 25th. And whereas Skip Alex George, along with Andrea Heffernan, Catherine Haley, and Virginia Giorgales, defeated previously unbeaten Horton High 7-4 in the provincial final after advancing with an 8-6 win over Bridgewater in the provincial semifinal. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs of this House congratulate the Alexis George Rink from Dr. J.H. Gillis School in Antigonish for winning the 2007 NSAF Girls Championship. Wish them the very best with all their future and current studies and athletic pursuits. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Brian Hayden received the Volunteer of the Year Award at the Truro Sport Heritage Society's 23rd Annual Sports Awards Dinner. Whereas Brian Hayden worked with over 100 young golfers as the 2006 Junior Club Chair of the Truro Golf Club. Whereas Brian Hayden's tutelage included skills, understanding the game, sportsmanship, and human relations, and he was a role model for all of these qualities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Brian Hayden on earning the Volunteer of the Year Award from the Truro Sports Heritage Society and thank him for his exceptional leadership to young people. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Stephen Anthony of Bedford represented Nova Scotia in the 2007 Canada Winter Games, and whereas Stephen demonstrated excellence in his chosen sport of hockey, whereas Stephen's skills and dedication to his sport have been recognized by peers and his efforts applauded by the community of Bedford, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House extend their congratulations to Stephen. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each month, North Colchester High School recognizes a male and female student who have made positive contributions to their classes and the life of North Colchester High School. And whereas grade 9 student Daniel McKenzie shows strong academic ability, leadership skills, and a concern for the well-being of his teachers and his peers. And whereas Daniel is an excellent example of good citizenship. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House extend their congratulations to grade 9 student Daniel McKenzie of North Colchester High School for being selected Male Student of the Month. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Opposed by nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Michelle and Mary Ella d'Entremont, Middle West Pubnico, are known in their community for their kindness and generosity, having volunteered with the Canadian Cancer Society's Relay for Life and helping with many fundraising efforts. And whereas because of ongoing medical issues, problems, Mike, as he's known, is unable to work. And whereas the community has rallied behind Mike and Mariella through the efforts of a large committee to organize a fundraising drive. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in recognizing the work that Michelle and Mary Ella d'Entremont have done in their community and thanking the community for showing their support for this family. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Opposed by nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Windsor West Hants continues to show promising economic growth, and whereas one of the more truly invigorating projects now underway is the restoration of the old textile mill and a development known as Mill Island, and whereas owners Kevin Keefe and Terry Hines, along with project coordinator Kathy Cox and designers, have included condominium development along with a retail area encompassing old world European markets into the spectacular new renovation and soon-to-be commercial and residential operation. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud the incredulous vision and entrepreneurial spirit of Kevin Keefe and Terry Hines for establishing Mill Island and working towards something all of Windsor West Hants can be immensely proud of. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Opposed by nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Francis Collins was recognized for his community contributions at the 2007 African Heritage Month banquet hosted by the African Nova Scotia community of Truro, whereas Francis Collins has been a community leader for many years and in 1982 was co-founder of the Colchester Black Social Club, now known as the Community Enhancement Association, and he served as president, treasurer, and board member. And whereas Francis Collins is a founder and president of the Stan Maxwell Memorial Playground, served on the Truro Parks and Recreation Commission, and has extensively documented the history of black athletes of Truro. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Francis Collins for being recognized by the African Nova Scotia community of Truro, thank him for his continuing community services and leadership, and extend to him and Francis, his wife, best wishes for the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Opposed by nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day you should move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Yarmouth Motor Mart Mariners have been an integral part of the Yarmouth hockey scene over the past 5 years. And whereas Mr. Georges d'Entremont of West Pubnico, captain of the team, has played with the Mariners for 4 years. And whereas Mr. d'Entremont, who is in his final year of eligibility in the Maritime Junior A Hockey League, played his last home game on February 18th of this year. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in thanking Mr. Georges d'Entremont for his contribution to the sport of hockey in Yarmouth County. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary by nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the girls basketball team at Dr. J.H. Gillis High and Antigonish has had a steadying influence of coaching and instruction over the years. And whereas the 2006-07 season saw Ms. Gail McDougall coach her 1,000th game as head coach of the J.H. Gillis Royals, and whereas Gail recently completed her 27th consecutive year as head coach of the girls basketball Royals, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House applaud the exceptional instructional and athletic inspirational efforts of Gail McDougall through 27 years as she coaches her second century of basketball as head coach of the Dr. J.H. Gillis girls team in Antigonish. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Valley Communications in Kenful, who answer emergency calls across 7 counties, were kept very busy this past weekend answering a total of 141 calls. And whereas the majority of calls were for firefighters in Kings County, who responded to everything from house to brush to what one fire chief described as a barn fire without the barn, involving a field plus 250 round bales of hay emitting thick blanks of toxic smoke from plastic wrap bales. And where such calls need support and immediate attention in organizations second to none by trained emergency dispatchers, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House applaud the tremendous efforts of both Valley Communications owner Joan Garden and her professionally based Kentville staff and all volunteer firefighters from across Kings County who endured a tiring and challenging weekend. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members. Question period will begin at 3:12 and end at 4:52. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
4:52.
My question this afternoon will be through you to the Premier. To say today has been a devastating day for the citizens of Pictou County, Mr. Speaker, would be an understatement. The news this morning that Greenbrier intends to close the Trenton Works railcar plant will lead to hundreds of direct and probably hundreds of indirect job losses. Mr. Speaker, since 1872, this industry has been a major employer in our province. Local plant manager Bob Hickey summed up the plant's importance to the broader community, saying, local businesses throughout Pictou County supply the plant, and our workers are known to spend their hard-earned pay primarily within the community. So my question, through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is this. Will the Premier tell Pictou County residents and this House what specific steps and plans his government offered to ensure the viability of this key industry?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, it is a very, very sad day for the people of Pictou County and the Trenton area. Trenton Works and the workers and their families, Mr. Speaker. Trenton Works has been a mainstay in that part of Nova Scotia, part of the culture, part of who individuals are. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure there's not anyone who lives in that community or that region who doesn't have a family member who has worked there at the plant. The government has taken a number of steps, Mr. Speaker, and we have had ongoing dialogue with those from Trenton Works on this issue. We made as well, Mr. Speaker, we also put forward in an effort to try and save Trenton Works a generous offer, Mr. Speaker, from the people of Nova Scotia that would be provided in a number of key areas that would total about $14.5 million, Mr. Speaker. It was a generous offer, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the company has had to make a company decision, and that is where we find ourselves here at the present time.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the workforce at Trenton Works has been up and down now for some time, but it is no doubt that the Premier, as many observed, that this plant was experiencing difficulties. Greenbrier's expansion into Mexico was well underway. Work that was being done by Nova Scotians will go to a new plant in Mexico. Now, we know that the Pictou Regional Development Authority was working hard to gain new markets for Trenton Works, And I would like to think that the province has also been fully engaged with securing the future of this industry. So I would like to ask the Premier, through you, Mr. Speaker, what concrete steps will the government now be taking to seek diversification and new opportunities to take advantage of the trained workforce and the existing facilities?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, as I mentioned, the government was working with management at the plant, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, there were trips taken to places such as Fort McMurray out in Alberta and taking a look at ways to drum up new business for a variety of businesses, of which included Trenton Works. And Mr. Speaker, I can assure the Leader of the Opposition, through you, Mr. Speaker, that the Government of Nova Scotia will work with the local Regional Development Association, will work with local leadership, Mr. Speaker, on the business side and the political side, to seek out all efforts that we can to see more work for the people of the Pictou area. And we will do so through NSBI and OED, Mr. Speaker, but it will take some time. But the government is willing to do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, while the efforts to find a new use for this plant are ongoing, there's going to be a need for provincially led retraining and skills development assistance for the workforce. We also know that some of the Trenton Works employees are close to retirement, and they may well have difficulty finding a new job here in Nova Scotia. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is what consideration has the government, through you to the Premier, what consideration has the government given to the kind of assistance, transitional assistance, and severance packages that these workers will and their families will require if they are to stay in this province?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, much like the government did with respect to the situation with Maple Leaf, where the Department of Education had individuals in place to specifically deal with the very difficult situation that workers found themselves in there. We will be taking the similar steps in Pictou County with respect to the situation faced there. I can assure that member. In fact, Mr. Speaker, even before question period, I took the time to make a call to Bob Hickey myself. Fortunately, I wasn't able to get a hold of him, but certainly I want to be speaking with either himself or another representative of the company in the next 24 hours.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, today we learned that the Trenton Works railcar plant in central Nova Scotia will close later this year. This recent closure will mean the elimination of 330 well-paying jobs. Less than 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, this facility employed approximately 1,200 Nova Scotians and was key to the workforce not only in this area but to our entire provincial economy. Mr. Speaker, this will have a devastating blow to Pictou County and surrounding areas. My question to the Premier is, what is your government's plan to aid the people working at Trenton Works Limited who learned today that they are out of a job?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And already the Department of Education has been in contact with officials on the ground, Mr. Speaker, to do all we can for the workers and their families. The member for Cape Breton for Pictou Centre has been very involved in this, having worked there himself, I believe, for a short period of time, Mr. Speaker. And so he has been a strong representative on the part of the people he represents to ensure that government is doing all it can through economic development and through my office. And, Mr. Speaker, that is the type of collaboration we will continue to have in the days ahead to do all we can for the people of Pictou County.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, very few companies in Nova Scotia can boast of having had over 1,200 employees on their payroll. And Nova Scotians today are left to wonder how this company has fallen below the government's radar screen. And with all due respect to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, while some employees may be looking for retraining opportunities, more importantly, 330 families are looking for jobs, is what they need to feed their families and provide for their families here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, while the Premier speaks about wanting to bring Nova Scotians back here to Nova Scotia from Western Canada. It makes it quite difficult to do that when you lose the well-paying tradesmen's job that were provided at companies such as Trenton Works. So my question to the Premier is, what is your plan today to increase economic development in rural Nova Scotia in light of the most recent closure at Trenton Works?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, the government has been working in collaboration with the company already. We were helping to seek and taking a look at new opportunities out there for the company, Mr. Speaker. We had hoped, and I know everyone in this House had hoped, that we would see success for that company, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of the day, they had to make a private sector decision, and we respect that. We will do all we can for the tradespeople in that part of the province. We will do all we can for those families, Mr. Speaker, in helping to help them, whether it be retraining or seeking new opportunities for employment, Mr. Speaker. Our government has been very, very successful in the area of growing jobs here in our province, Mr. Speaker, and we won't let this issue stop us from growing opportunity for the people.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the economic importance of this company simply cannot be measured. This company has been vital to the stability of this community and families for over 135 years. Yet, Mr. Speaker, this government has done very little to keep rural Nova Scotia companies in business. And while the Premier has his rose-coloured glasses on, he may be reminded of the situation facing Nova Scotia's hog industry, the closure of the Maple Leaf plant in Kennard, the closure of the EDS call centre in Port Hawkesbury in his own riding, and now the Trenton Works facility. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are wondering, where will it all end? The Premier and his government need to wake up and realize that the best way to ensure growth in Nova Scotia's workforce is to keep the people we already have working. Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary to the Premier is, when can we expect your government to put plans into action to revive rural Nova Scotia, stop companies from shutting down, and keeping our people from leaving Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed, Mr. Speaker, to growing the economy of Nova Scotia, and we will do so by continuing to invest in infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. We will do so by helping to train young Nova Scotians and helping them to provide more opportunities to stay at home. We will do so, Mr. Speaker, by investing in areas such as information technology, by making sure we invest in our education system. And, Mr. Speaker, we have had success and we have seen thousands of new jobs created here in Nova Scotia because this government has done so, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do so in the future, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be through you to the Premier. Rural Nova Scotia is the home of world-class and world-scale manufacturing industries. Michelin, Oxford Frozen Foods, Stora Enso are good examples of how our workers and how our communities can match anyone, anywhere else in the world when it comes to highly skilled, value-added manufacturing. However, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have seen 2 significant plants close this year alone in Maple Leaf Poultry and now Trenton Works. Farmers are very apprehensive about the future of Larson's and Berwick. So my question through you to the Premier is, will the Premier tell this House, and rural Nova Scotians in particular, how his government intends to keep and build our manufacturing sector?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one such example of what the government is doing, Mr. Speaker, is a recent trip in December that NSBI took 27 companies, Nova Scotian companies, to take them out there to drum up business for those companies, Mr. Speaker. And many companies there were very successful. And if you take a look at what companies like Mulgrave Machine Works are doing and sending out pressurized containers, Mr. Speaker, out to places like Alberta, it's providing an opportunity not only for us to export, but to keep our young people home, to keep our young people home with their families, keep our young people home here to invest in our province and the future of our province. Mr. Speaker, after January, Mr. Speaker, I went personally to Alberta with other leaders in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, went to Alberta with other premiers from Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that the companies that went on that trip were also successful, Mr. Speaker. Companies like the McGregor Group in Pictou County, Mr. Speaker, had great success while on that trade, just to name one company, Mr. Speaker. That is the type of thing the government of Nova Scotia is working on.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With all that, the Premier seemed to have missed the fact that the unemployment rate in Nova Scotia went down because people are leaving to go to Alberta. So not exactly good news, Mr. Speaker. Too often in this province, it seems that that rather than leading, we are spectators when it comes to the development of our rural economy. And this is particularly true with regard to keystone manufacturing industries that generate large economic benefits. Nova Scotians have seen how, for example, Mr. Speaker, how Edmundston, New Brunswick was better positioned than Nova Scotia to seize the immediate opportunities arising out of the closure of Maple Leaf Poultry. People wonder why our government seems to lack the same drive and entrepreneurial spirit. So my question through you to the Speaker is this: what plan does the Premier have to reverse the sense that rural industry is shutting down instead of taking advantage of Nova Scotians' proven success and skills in manufacturing?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition alluded to the unemployment rate, Mr. Speaker, here in Nova Scotia. And if he thinks that's simply because people are leaving the province, he is dead wrong, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, employment in Nova Scotia rose by 9,000 from last year, the beginning of 2006, Mr. Speaker, to this year, Mr. Speaker. The unemployment rate has dropped, Mr. Speaker, in this province because this government and the private sector have worked together, Mr. Speaker, to create new opportunities, Mr. Speaker, new opportunities for people here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, that is why Halifax, Mr. Speaker, east of the prairies, Mr. Speaker, has the lowest unemployment rate of any of the major cities, Mr. Speaker, here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Premier actually believes that people aren't leaving Nova Scotia to go to Alberta, it just shows how incredibly out of touch with reality he is, Mr. Speaker. The government seems to think its job
Order,
is to
please. Order. I would just remind those visiting the gallery, we welcome everyone to Province House at any day, but you cannot show either in favour or contrary to the activity on the floor of the legislature. I would just note that as we proceed through question period, the Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
I didn't mind, Mr. Speaker.
I did.
Mr. Speaker, the government seems to think its job is simply to wait for someone to come asking for a subsidy, then decide whether or not to hand out money. So I would suggest that the residents of Pictou County, Kings County, and the other areas of proven economic strength are looking for more. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is this: does the Premier see any need to change his government's approach to economic development?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to growing the economy here in our province, Mr. Speaker. Well, we cannot do it alone. We will do it by continuing to work with other levels of government. We will do it by continuing to work with the private sector, by working with the regional development authorities and others, Mr. Speaker. The facts speak for themselves, Mr. Speaker. At this point in time, we are seeing one of the lowest unemployment rates in the history of this province, Mr. Speaker. We are seeing more and more jobs being created in areas such as the financial industries, Mr. Speaker, in areas such as information technology, Mr. Speaker. We are seeing more opportunities for product being delivered out to the western provinces, Mr. Speaker. This government is capturing those opportunities, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my question is going to be for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, by filtering the federal monies for early learning and childcare out over 10 years, the department is unable to use it to make a difference for families who need childcare now, not in 10 years. This money could be used to make childcare more affordable by establishing maximum daily rates for centres province-wide, ensuring that childcare is affordable for Nova Scotia families. So my question for the Minister is this: why isn't your department putting this money towards establishing maximum daily rates in childcare centres?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank my honourable colleague, the Leader of the Opposition, for bringing this very important issue to the floor of the legislature today. Mr. Speaker, this government in May, introduced a 10-year, $137 million plan, Mr. Speaker, for all Nova Scotian families from one end of this province to the other, Mr. Speaker. This plan will benefit, Mr. Speaker, this plan will benefit all Nova Scotian families, Mr. Speaker. It provides choice in childcare. It is a 10-year sustained long-term plan, Mr. Speaker, because we all know the importance of building today for the future of tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. That's the commitment of this government, Mr. Speaker, and that's the commitment that we will continue to uphold.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the new grant system that the minister refers to provides funds to centres based on the number of children in care, not on the basis of what the centre needs. This creates a situation where larger centres have an even greater financial advantage than they would otherwise. So my question to the minister is this: why aren't federal funds being used to ensure that smaller, community-focused centres can stay in business?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I thank the Honourable Leader of the Opposition for allowing me to rise and continue, Mr. Speaker, to explain to the good folks of Nova Scotia the fine program that this government is putting in place. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, I'm extremely pleased to say, Mr. Speaker, under the new plan, no one will receive less funding, Mr. Speaker, because on the chance that that was going to happen, Mr. Speaker, we grandparented any centre who may be in that position, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we've leveled the playing field for all health care providers and for all families in Nova Scotia who require the health care services that we provide, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, beyond the need for affordable, accessible childcare is the need to maintain the high level of care that Nova Scotian families expect and deserve. To do this, we need to recruit and retain workers. So my question to the Speaker, through the Speaker, to the Minister is this: when will your department recognize the qualifications of early childhood educators and pay them accordingly?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a mother of 4 children and as an educator, I appreciate and value, Mr. Speaker, the professional services that are provided by the child care sector in this province, Mr. Speaker. There is no question that the future of this province lies in the hands of the children of today, Mr. Speaker. That's why this government committed $54 million of the $137 million, Mr. Speaker, to the retention recruitment portion of the operating grants, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we have qualified, quality child care individuals in the sector, Mr. Speaker, to respond to all those needs of all the Nova Scotian families who require child care, Mr. Speaker, in the province.
The Honourable Member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. The Minister of Community Services announced new funding for childcare providers earlier last month in the form of a revamped childcare operating grant. In reality, this new funding is not new at all, but rather just a repackaged and redistribution of an already existing operating grant. The only change is that now it not only applies to nonprofit centres, but it is also available for the profit commercial childcare centres. And some centres say they will see no benefit at all from this program. So my question to the minister is, what does the minister say to those child care professionals who won't see any benefit from this repackaged operation grant?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleague across the way who brings forth again the important question, Mr. Speaker, of long-term sustained childcare in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable colleague is a parent and has those same concerns that I spoke of earlier, Mr. Speaker. The $54 million commitment, Mr. Speaker, for the operational grants does exactly as my honourable colleague asks. It allows for these centres, all centres, Mr. Speaker, and I repeat, all centres, because we are levelling the playing field to provide the best possible option for Nova Scotian families. Choice in childcare, Mr. Speaker, because that's what it's all about. It's about childcare. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the $5 million extra in grants going to those centres who would not have qualified before, Mr. Speaker, indeed is a welcome commitment, Mr. Speaker, by this government.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of confusion in the industry around who actually will receive benefit from this new revamped childcare program. So I would encourage the minister to find somebody in that department to articulate that message to the childcare professionals around Nova Scotia. The truth about the new operating grant is that the toddler and preschool grants are being reduced from $4 a day to $3 a day. Daycare centres will no longer be able to predict their income for a full fiscal year because the department can now review payments after 6 months. The new funding structure will provide no increase to teacher salaries. It may even result in a decrease for some teachers, as daycare centres will receive less money under the new funding structure. The new funding structure has eliminated whatever stability previously existed. The previous funding grant was predictable. It just wasn't enough. If the true intention of the revamped operating grant program was to put more money in the pockets of the underpaid daycare professionals, the program has missed the mark. So my question to the minister, which childcare professionals did the minister consult with before changing this funding structure, and what problems was the change expected to solve?
The honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again to my honourable colleague across the way. Indeed, the message is going out, Mr. Speaker. We have been working extensively with the child care sector, Mr. Speaker. We have had numerous consultations prior to the creation and development of the plan. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, 20 consultation sessions across this province were held to help develop Nova Scotia's sustainable plan, Mr. Speaker. We've had thousands, Mr. Speaker, of surveys completed and participant feedback, Mr. Speaker, to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we did engage those stakeholders, and we will continue to communicate, Mr. Speaker, with the stakeholders, with families, with child care providers across the province, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that those who are not clear on the issue, Mr. Speaker, indeed are clear, Mr. Speaker, with the information they require.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, the minister makes reference to a 10-year early learning and child care plan and how many things this plan can do for the province. And yet, every year, every day, we hear daycare operator after daycare operator who is extremely unhappy about the lack of planning and vision and focus within this department. So my question for the minister is, will the minister acknowledge that her department has missed the boat on preparing a true early learning and child care planning by failing to elicit the advice of child care professionals?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 10 years of creation and sustainability, Mr. Speaker. Over 1,000 spaces, Mr. Speaker. Dollars to go to repair and renovation, Mr. Speaker, using energy efficiency, Mr. Speaker. Over 500 subsidized spaces, Mr. Speaker. Operational grants to the tune of $54 million, Mr. Speaker. Family home child care, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable colleague has had difficulty finding the information, Mr. Speaker, on the plan, for he referenced that. Mr. Speaker, I'd love to table in the House today for my honourable colleague's perusal at a later date, Mr. Speaker, the early learning and child care, our children, our future. The plan for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. The recently announced Child Care Operating Grant will replace the salary enhancement, equipment, infrastructure, and infant care grants that had been issued to nonprofit centres. Centres will now receive a total of $8 per day for infants and $3 per day for children 18 months to school age. There are no monies provided for school-age children, however. School-age children will still need to be staffed. So my question to the Minister, why is your department not providing for school-age children who require care at lunch, before and after school, and during school breaks?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague for bringing a very important issue to the floor here today. Mr. Speaker, we have indeed in the department streamlined, Mr. Speaker, our grant process in order to make it easier, Mr. Speaker, for all of our child care providers. As the plan moves forward, Mr. Speaker, and we're able to take the dollars, take the commitment made by this government, and, Mr. Speaker, allocate those dollars where they best fit, all options, as my honourable colleague has brought forward, all of the options regarding day school-age children, Mr. Speaker, part-day centres, Mr. Speaker, will all be taken into consideration as part of that 10-year sustained plan, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just want to remind the minister that funding was there for those children. It's now been cancelled, and in the meantime, Nova Scotian families are suffering. They need that help. Mr. Speaker, this new grant requires that a minimum of 75% of the funds allocated be spent on salary and benefits. Recruitment and retention of early childhood educators is a huge problem in Nova Scotia. Despite requiring a high level of education, these staff are only paid between $7.50 and $11 per hour. So my question to the minister, why isn't your department investing in sustainable salary increases instead of a grant that changes every 6 months depending on preschool enrollment?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And there's no question, Mr. Speaker, the quality in childcare is the utmost, Mr. Speaker, and that is indeed why part of this $137 million plan, Mr. Speaker, is the commitment of the $54 million that goes to the operational grants, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely, as my colleague has referenced, 75% of those dollars going to the centres is for the retention and the recruitment of the very quality childcare staff that we have across this province, Mr. Speaker. I have the utmost confidence that the retention and the recruitment of that staff will be successful, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South Portland Valley on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Too little, almost too late, Mr. Speaker. It was clear from the 2005 child care consultations results that the only effective recruitment and retention measure is to provide funding to significantly increase salaries and benefits. So my question, besides a fluctuating grant, what is your department doing to meet this priority?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I have absolutely the utmost confidence in our child care sector, Mr. Speaker. I know that they will deliver, continue to deliver, that quality child care that they have in the past, and they will in the future, Mr. Speaker, and they will do so in the future, Mr. Speaker, with the commitment and the support of this government, Mr. Speaker.
Before proceeding, I just want to note to all members that the time duration for both asking of questions and answering them is becoming prolonged. I've checked the logs, and we're extending by a full minute to 2 minutes in some questions. So be forewarned that we will now be tightening them up. The honourable member for Pictou West has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. Nova Scotians consider public libraries to be vital centres of discovery and lifelong learning. The Pictou-Antigonish Regional Library, with a dedicated staff of 34 and 7 branch libraries, has been a success story. In recent years, there's been a 60% increase in program attendance, a 400% increase in the use of the online library, and a 33% increase in internet use. However, Board Chairman Bill Rayfuse recently stated that without substantial funding increases from the province, the library story isn't going to have a happy ending. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is the province going to come to the table and pay their fair share of our libraries? When are they going to do this?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, the library system that we have in our province is a valued system. We have 9 boards, 77 sites around the province, and we value the work that those sites do, the opportunities they provide, the resources that they have available. We have this year been able to add to the base of our dollars for the libraries across the province, a $1 million addition to their base, and we look forward to working with them on their new strategic plan to keep libraries alive in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Pictou West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is that the Pictou-Antigonish Regional Library has suffered a shortfall in provincial funding. And during the past 6 years, provincial funding has only gone up by a total of 9%. Municipal funding has had to increase by 35%, and the board's own fundraising has had to rise by 313% just to make ends meet. The Consumer Price Index has jumped by 21% during that time. So my question, when is the government going to recognize the importance of public libraries the same way our municipalities and communities do and contribute accordingly?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, I will repeat that we do value and recognize the importance of libraries across this province. And beyond the funding that comes to the libraries, I think it's important to recognize that we as a Department of Education do pick up some costs for those libraries. One of those major costs is internet accessibility in all of the libraries. That is our cost. That saves the library boards that money.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this is a very serious matter for our libraries, and the Minister's own department published a document a few years ago called Funding the Power of Libraries, which stated that the funding requirement for public libraries for a 3-year period would have to be $44.5 million. Currently, we're nowhere near this investment level. So my final question to the Minister, when are we going to see the funding promised 4 years ago for our provincial libraries?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite and to all members of the House. There are priorities that our department has to set. There are services that we wish to maintain, and our budget this year reflects our commitment to maintain library services across the province.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Public Works. Mr. Speaker, often we argue in this House over what we believe is right and what is best for Nova Scotians. They have elected each of us to represent them in the House of Assembly to the best of our abilities, and it's our responsibility to provide them with the best possible solution. In the past, government has allowed the issue of crosswalk safety to be a secondary issue, and it's clear that we cannot allow this to happen anymore. So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Transportation and Public Works announced that government and the Halifax Regional Municipality are forming a working group to improve crosswalk safety. So my first question to the Minister is, what is the mandate of this working group?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The mandate will be for that group to, first of all, consider recommendations that would kind of flow from the report off the symposium that was held in January, which I've referenced earlier in the House. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, they would consult with Road Safety Advisory Committee of the Province of Nova Scotia with respect to work that they are doing on an ongoing basis related to crosswalk safety. And also, Mr. Speaker, through our resources, ensure that we have the most up-to-date information from other jurisdictions, formulate a course of action, Mr. Speaker, and act on that course of action.
The Honourable Member for Clare on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at least 660 injuries and 11 deaths. Those are the figures we are dealing with, and government must take action on this matter now. The symposium report the Minister has spoken about is not due for at least another month. So how many more injuries will we see in this time frame? It seems every time that we open the paper or turn on the news, another person has been injured at a crosswalk. So, Mr. Minister, your working group must act promptly to increase awareness and safety at crosswalks for pedestrians and motorists. So my first supplementary to the Minister is, when will this working group be formed, and when will it be up and running?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The work that's required in order to formulate the group is in process now, and Mr. Speaker, it will be working very, very soon and in time to receive the report that I have referenced earlier. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we are examining our capacity within our budget to expand an awareness program with the province, because the honourable member is entirely correct that regardless of what we do with respect to engineering, with respect to the visibility of crosswalks and everything else, if we don't affect the mindset of pedestrians and of drivers with respect to crosswalks, Mr. Speaker, we will not succeed. And that has got to be the long-term objective, and we are continuously working at that.
The honourable member for Clare on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all need to work together to increase safety and awareness at crosswalks in Nova Scotia. It is the duty and responsibility of the province, municipalities, schools, and parents to instruct our children to use extreme caution when crossing a street. Mr. Speaker, we've seen how this Conservative government has listened to task force in the past. The task force on OHVs has had excellent planning and strategies, and the minister and his government only use recommendations that they saw fit to put into legislation. So I fear that we may have a task force and a symposium and a report expected to come out in May, and very little will come out of it. So my last question to the minister is, when the results of this symposium and report are completed, will your government take the appropriate measure to ensure the safety of Nova Scotians at crosswalks?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, I want to again commend the honourable member for bringing this important issue forward, and I very much appreciate the concern that he has articulated here, and I can say to him in response to his question that absolutely we will.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage. Or alternatively, Mr. Speaker, the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the restoration and operation of the Fortress of Louisbourg was initiated by the Government of Canada to sustain permanent, well-paying jobs in Cape Breton during difficult days when the coal and steel industry wound down. Mr. Speaker, the top rate of pay after many years of service there can be $30,000 a year, including benefits. This money is recycled in the local economy and supports other jobs. Parks Canada now wants to replace these workers with contract cleaners who will earn less than $17,000 a year with no benefits. So my question to the Premier is this: in light of the substantial benefits of this site to Cape Breton and its economy, what does he plan to do to save permanent public sector jobs from being contracted out by the federal Conservative government?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, Louisbourg is famous for its hospitality. It's famous for, Mr. Speaker, the fortress, of course. And Mr. Speaker, there's great news there in the last number of months, obviously, with the new investment and the development, $300 million development, which will be occurring there as well. So that's great news for the people of that area. Mr. Speaker, indeed, what the member is asking is with respect to what's happening at the fortress, which is under federal jurisdiction, Mr. Speaker. Again, I don't have the details at hand. I will be sure to get those details through the Department of Tourism, if they have any, with respect to the issue at hand, and will provide them to the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table a letter I received from Ms. Karen Pink. She's the president of the local Public Service Alliance of Canada, Mr. Speaker. In this letter, Ms. Pink states, "I am sure people would prefer a $15 an hour job which pays benefits over a $9 an hour job with no benefits. Parks Canada, believe it or not, Mr. Speaker, despite the impact on these people, will only save about $50,000 a year from the change." So my second question to the Premier is, how does he plan to persuade his federal counterpart that Cape Breton working families deserve better treatment?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, the issue at hand will be brought to the attention of the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage, Mr. Speaker, to bring forward to ensure that the Minister federally is aware of what's happening at the fortress, and the Minister that's responsible, Mr. Speaker, and I give the assurance to the Leader of the Opposition that the Government of Nova Scotia will do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My third question will actually be for the Minister of Environment and Labour. Mr. Speaker, some people might say that a $9 an hour job is better than no job at all. However, such a drop in wages would mean the loss to the local economy of $5,000 each season per worker. That's not a huge sum of money considering the federal government surplus, but in Lewisburg, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, it's quite a chunk of change. So my final question to the Minister is, what are they going to do to preserve the dignity and standard of living of these Nova Scotia workers?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and our Department of Labour is active working, partnering with the Department of Education, with other departments, Department of Tourism, to help ensure good-paying jobs for Nova Scotians. And we will deal with the federal government, and we will speak to the federal government, and we will try and do our part as the Premier committed on behalf of all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Nice to have something.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health Promotion and Protection. Mr. Speaker, this morning we discovered that the Department has handed over to Commonwealth Games budget on January 29, 2007, just 1 month before you made the decision to end the bid after spending $7.7 million. We also heard from witnesses that the Minister, the Issue Committee of Cabinet, and the Premier are getting weekly briefings of the status of the budget and the status of the bid process. So, Mr. Minister, what exactly do you know, when did you exactly know that the cost of the Games was spiraling out of control?
The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion and Protection.
Mr. Speaker, we knew the cost as estimated by the Bid Society on the 29th of January, and we began to develop a due diligence process that would see consultants analyze the bids. We partnered with the federal government, the municipality, and ourselves. Each level of government funded or cost shared in the due diligence studies that resulted in the decision that we ended up making that $1.7 billion was more than 3 levels of government could afford, and that there were significant risks associated with hosting these games. That's why we made the decision we made, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Minister, there are only two options here. Either you didn't know for quite some time and did nothing to address this issue, or you were not aware and did not do due diligence on your end to ensure that the highest value for tax dollars were addressed. Even without the bid going forward, the province, HR, and the federal government spent over $7.7 million. $7.7 million to go a long way in many of our communities. So I'd expect the Minister would have been more involved in every step of the bid and every step of the way. The question to the Minister is, so Mr. Minister, when you saw that the bid was growing on affordable rate, why did you not interject and keep the budget at an acceptable rate or shut the thing down much sooner?
The Honourable Minister of Health Promotion and Protection.
Mr. Speaker, I told the member opposite in my first answer that I became aware of the total cost projected by the Bid Society on the 29th of January. From that point on, we did our due diligence. It identified a number of significant risks, Mr. Speaker, and as I said in my first answer, the government, as a funding partner, was not prepared to move forward with the games that cost $1.7 billion and identified those risks associated. Maybe the opposition parties were, but we weren't, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Minister, the opposition parties didn't make a decision on this. You did.
Order, please. Order, please. Just remind the Honourable Member you have to address to the Chair and not directly to a Minister.